Hello, it's Dr. DeBord, and I hope you and your families are doing okay during this time. This is my second attempt at trying to create a video on classical conditioning for you. I realized the first time that as I walk through and do this, that I'll make mistakes, and so sometimes I'll just have to say, okay, I'm going to start this part over. So bear with me. If this helps, great. If it doesn't, you can watch other YouTube videos that I'm planning to post for class. If you missed the class time before spring break, we covered classical conditioning and the theories of learning. I'd like to do a little bit of review of those things with the slide that I have here. There are three models of learning that we will cover for the quiz or the test that we're going to have on Friday. By the way, that test it will be available tomorrow, and you will be able to take that test twice, and the better of your two grades will be used in your score. So the three models of learning that we have are classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. So these are the three here. I think you can see those. I put here some kind of shortened descriptions of each. Classical conditioning is about reflexes, about bringing about a kind of reaction, emotional reaction or physical reaction based on a sort of reflex that we have in our body. Operant conditioning is a lot simpler. That is about rewards and punishments. And observational learning is what it sounds like, learning by watching other people. So those are the three things we have. I'm going to try to scroll down a little bit. Let's see if I can do that. Worked. There we go. These are some of the basic terms I would like you to know. First of all, actually, when you see the test on Friday, if you have any classical conditioning questions, you can get to the right answer by asking yourself about these four things. First, if you can ask yourself, is he talking about a stimulus or response? That will get you to cancel out two of the possible four choices in the multiple choice format. A stimulus is something that comes from the environment that affects our bodies. A response then is something that comes from our bodies in reaction to the stimulus. So that can be an emotion, that could be a bodily reaction like sweating, it could be like salivating if you were there for my discussion on Pavlov's dogs. It could be blinking, it could be jerking back. So those are things that come from our body, those are responses. The other two areas, the two terms I'd like you to be familiar with is unconditioned. If something is unconditioned, it happens automatically without any prior experience or any learning history. Then the other term, conditioned, that is applied when you acquire an association through experience, or you pick up basically a learned reaction through repeated exposure to a pairing of two stimuluses or two stimuli. So I'm going to, actually, I'd like you to watch the videos on Pavlov's dogs. I think it explains those terms for that study pretty well. Basically, I can give you this in a very brief form, that this researcher, Pavlov, took dogs and he realized that if he put food in a hungry dog's mouth, it would salivate. So if I were to ask you what food was in that particular point in the experiment, you would ask yourself, is food a stimulus or response? And of course you would say stimulus. And then you'd have to say, well, does the dog automatically respond, a hungry dog, to food in its mouth, or does it have to learn that? And that's automatic. So the food would be an unconditioned stimulus. What Pavlov learned he could do, what he realized he could do, was he could take something that's neutral, like the sound of a bell, and then use that to basically predict the appearance of food. And if he did that consistently enough, at some point when he just rings the bell, the dogs would start to salivate. And so what was originally a neutral stimulus, the sound of a bell, gains a lot of meaning and value. So it becomes a learned stimulus, or by the end of this experiment, the sound of a bell becomes a conditioned stimulus. So again, the sound of a bell is a stimulus, and at the end of it, it's conditioned because the dog learns, oh, when I hear the sound of the bell, I'm going to salivate. These are videos you can watch that help illustrate classical conditioning. This is a chart I put in place here that basically kind of walks you through the different terms. First, asking yourself over here, is it a stimulus or response? And then if it's automatic, it's an unconditioned stimulus or unconditioned response. If it's something that's learned, it's a conditioned stimulus or conditioned response. So you just pair those terms as you go through. The famous experiment that I described in chapter 1 when we were talking about the history of psychology involved this poor little kid. The biggest problem with this study, it was unethical. But early in the early days of psychology in the US, this researcher took this little kid, little Albert, and demonstrated that if you put a little white rat in front of him, the baby just played with it. Yeah, I think you probably remember talking about this in class. At this point, we're going to say that the toddler has no big reaction to the rat. It's just a neutral stimulus. Then they went up behind the poor kid and made a big loud noise behind his head. Now that loud noise made the kid cry. So if you have a loud noise presented to a kid and the toddler, little Albert, and he cries, that loud noise, I could ask you in a test question, is that a stimulus or response? And again, it's something from the environment, a loud noise, you would say that's a stimulus. Did this baby automatically respond to that, or did it have to learn to? Toddlers automatically cry to really loud noises. So we're going to call the sound of the loud noise an unconditioned stimulus, and his crying to that noise an unconditioned response. As you know what happened in the experiment, if you remember chapter 1, it was a long time ago in January. This researcher and his assistant put the white rat in front of little Albert. Once they had done that, they made a loud noise behind the kid's head, and he started crying. They took everything away, calmed him down, then repeated the procedure 4 or 5 times. Unethical, mean, cruel, shouldn't have been done. Then you can guess what happens at the end. They just put the little white rat in front of little Albert, and what's little Albert do? He starts to cry. At that point, what had originally been a neutral stimulus, the rat, has now gained meaning and value. The little Albert has learned to respond to the rat in a way that it did not at the beginning. So at the end of this experiment, when they present the rat to little Albert, you can ask yourself, is the rat at the end of the experiment a stimulus or response? Hopefully you would say stimulus because it's something the researchers presented to him. Did little Albert have to learn to respond to the rat, or did he do that automatically? Well, he didn't do that at the beginning, so it's not unconditioned. He learned to respond. So that rat at the end of the experiment is a conditioned stimulus, and his crying to the rat at the end of the experiment is a conditioned response. So classical conditioning is about learning associations, learning pairings of 2 different things. And that's really the basis of classical conditioning. This is kind of a description of the process of the little Albert experiment. Here are some more videos you could watch about this. I recommend it. One thing that, that John Watson, who had done the little Albert experiments, one of his students found is that you could actually use classical conditioning to help kids and to help adults too. And that is through a process called systematic desensitization. And in this situation, they realized if you can train a child to have a phobia, you can also use these sorts of conditions to remove a phobia. So imagine if you have a phobia of a spider, and if you see a spider, you just freak out and you want to run away. You have anxiety, all that going on. So in this situation, what Watson's student realized you could do was first train like therapy patients or whoever has the phobia to relax. And that takes a lot of skill. You have to really practice to like not fall asleep, but be able to get your body in a relaxed state with your heart rate down and your breathing down. Then you can come up with a list from least scary to most scary about things associated with a spider. The least scary thing a person might come up with is a crayon drawing of a spider. Next one might be a photograph of a dead spider. The next one might be a video of a spider. And it just increases in terms of intensity of the anxiety the stimulus provokes. What systematic desensitization does is basically ask a person to get in a relaxed state, and then they first introduce the least anxiety-provoking stimulus, the crayon drawing of the spider. If they can stay in that relaxed state, they move to the next step, which would be like the photograph of a dead spider. This is not fear factor. The goal is not to end up with a tarantula on your face. So they just do it to the point where a person can tolerate being around a spider without having a very strong sympathetic nervous system reaction. And that's how one of the ways we really, actually the faster version of this is called exposure therapy. It is based on the more formal step-by-step process of systematic desensitization. This will be the last slide about classical conditioning, because there are a number of things where this applies to everyday life. Let's go with taste aversions here. If you've ever had an aversion, if you smell something or think of a food and you automatically want to throw up, it's probably because you had a bad reaction to that food earlier in life. Now, taste aversions for us as humans, we are hardwired. It's called biologically prepared. I have that term up here, preparedness. We are biologically prepared to build some associations in our brain faster and more quickly than others. And think about this, if you tasted something really unusual or strongly flavored and later get sick, your brain associates that nausea, that illness, sick feeling with that really unique and unusual food or drink that you had earlier. Again, we start to build that association. But if we get sick after eating bread, we don't typically want to avoid bread because we've had so many decent positive experiences that kind of washes out the effect. So taste aversions develop because we start to feel ill and our brain automatically connects it with the most unusual or standout flavor that we had experienced in the previous few hours. Let's see, so I put down drug responses. If you can think of actually one thing that happens to the body, and this is a drug response that has actually led to a lot of deaths, is like cocaine. If a person takes coke, then what happens in the body naturally is a person's body will release an enzyme to metabolize that coke. And so it starts to process through that faster. That's one of the ways that tolerance develops. But imagine, so you have the unconditioned stimulus would be ingesting coke, and then the unconditional response is release this enzyme called dynorphin to metabolize it. The person does that consistently in the same place. Let's say they go to their same friend's apartment and they sit on the same couch every time they do it. What happens is that they'll start to develop a tolerance, but every time they sit on the couch, their body is going to start to release that enzyme. And so the couch, which was originally neutral, becomes a conditioned stimulus for the body then to release this enzyme, which processes a drug that they haven't even taken at this point. What happens then if a person goes to a brand new place, to a party, they don't know any of the people, they've never been there before, and they think, I can do this amount of the drug. Their body has not had the conditioned response to release that enzyme, and they will overwhelm their system and sometimes die because of heart failure, because their body has not been in the conditioned kind of stimulus conditioned response situation where they have been repeatedly exposed to before. Sleep is another area where classical conditioning happens. You know from the lecture in chapter 3 or 4 that when it starts to get dark, the suprachiasmatic nucleus tells the pineal gland release melatonin, a hormone, to get drowsy. Unconditioned stimulus, darkness, unconditioned response, release the melatonin. If you turn on a fan or you need music or the TV to fall asleep, basically those things which were originally neutral start to become conditioned stimuli, so that when you're exposed to those things that like the sound of a fan later on, you will have a conditioned response to feel drowsy. Um, let's see. I'm just going to jump down to panic phobias. Basically, what we have going on with PTSD. So you remember PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. So this happens so frequently. I think I've mentioned before, my brother is a psychologist at a veterans hospital in Illinois. And he's had situations where if there's a loud noise that actually somebody dropped something on his unit, he'll have patients who drop on the floor because that sounds like they're being attacked. Um, a lot of times when it comes to PTSD, people exposed to combat um, have PTSD responses, kind of panic reactions. So you can imagine a situation if a person, let's say, was deployed in Afghanistan and they had been attacked on a regular basis at evening time. If that were the case, basically the attack itself is going to be the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response is going to be fear. But if it happens consistently at evening, basically what's going to happen to those soldiers as it gets dusk, as it gets dark time, the evening time, that evening time atmosphere is going to be enough to stimulate that anxiety and that fear. So what was originally a neutral stimulus, evening time, gains value and meaning as a predictor of something terrible that's going to happen, being attacked, which is being attacked is the unconditioned stimulus. So the evening time, which was originally neutral, becomes a conditioned stimulus, which produces the anxiety and fear that it originally did not do. But because of pairings, associations, it does at the end. I hope this has helped with some of your understanding of classical conditioning. I'm also going to post a couple other videos on the module about classical conditioning. And then hopefully tomorrow I will post one about operant conditioning. Thanks for being with me.